Welcome to the Darkstream, VoxDay, VoxDay.blogspot.com, and Infogalactic News. We're not going to discuss it tonight, but obviously the big news of the day is the God Emperor pulling the USA out of the Paris Accord on unicorn farts, or actually climate change, as they call it. So that was the big news of the day. Happy to see that the God Emperor carried through on one of his campaign promises. He also didn't. He also backtracked on his promise about moving the embassy to Jerusalem. But frankly, I think that's a lot less significant than not turning over the U.S. national sovereignty to some ridiculous, poorly conceived globalist institution. Now, I promised that I would do part 2 on free trade. Some of you reminded me what that constituted, which was useful. And so I'm going to go ahead and talk about that tonight. But first, let me give you just a little, for those of you who are tempted to bring up Econ 101 and that sort of stuff, let me just give you a little bit of background so that you understand what you're dealing with here, okay? Now, you might see these books by Joseph Schumpeter and Milton Friedman are very old. I'm not sure of the publication date. This one is so old it doesn't even seem to have a date on it. It's from the University of Chicago Press. Oh, here we go, 1962. This is the 1970 edition. So this was published when I was 2 years old. This one by Schumpeter is 1961. Fourth printing 1965. So this book is older than I am. This book was published when I was 2, or printed when I was 2. My dad had me reading these things when I was 10. Okay? The Theory of Economic Development by Schumpeter, Capitalism and Friedman by Milton Friedman. I didn't do quite as well. Those were good. Free to Choose was great. I didn't do so well with this book, The Optimum Quantity of Money and Other Theories, or Other Essays. Problem was they involved all kinds of pretty serious math that I was not, I didn't even know at the time. So, when they're kind of throwing calculus at you at 10 and you haven't done algebra yet, that's a little bit beyond you. Now we're talking about free trade. Okay, what is the first word? What is the first name that always pops up when you hear about free trade? When you talk about free trade? When people are discussing free trade? How do people like to posture and pretend that they are educated? No, not Friedman. You guys know this. Come on, not Friedman. We're talking free trade. Not Adam Smith either, but closer. Not Mises. Not Hazlitt. Hazlitt's too sophisticated. Not Hayek. Come on. David Ricardo. There you go. Okay, now, how many of you have actually read any Ricardo at all? What's kind of funny is whenever I start talking about free trade, it's very common for somebody who considers themselves to be educated to say, Ricardo, this is the modern, Space Bunny was making fun of it on Twitter earlier today. This is the modern intellectual disease. Because we have heard more educated, smarter people talk about things, we think that we understand them. And it's not true. For example, the section on free trade in the Principles of Political Economy and Taxation is about 15 pages long. It's actually less sophisticated than practically anyone writing on free trade since. And so, and if you want to know more about it, I actually don't recommend that you read Ricardo himself. I mean, definitely do so if you doubt that the things are described correctly, but the correct book to read is Free Trade Doesn't Work by Ian Fletcher. Now, Fletcher does not make his arguments are not the same as mine. He does not talk about labor mobility. Okay, that's a new argument that I developed. He does not talk about what I'm going to talk about with regards to Henry Hazlitt, because he is focused on Ricardo and he's focused on general economic statistics. However, this Ian Fletcher's Free Trade Doesn't Work is the best basic starter book on free trade because it covers Ricardo in detail. It covers the comparative advantage theory in detail. So, now I actually have some notes here which I'm going to have to refer to because Henry Hazlitt lays out Henry Hazlitt lays out a case that is considered to be probably among non-economists, among people who are educated about economics, but are not serious economists themselves. Henry Hazlitt's case for free trade is probably the second most well-known after David Ricardo. You might throw Mises in there as well, but the reason is Hazlitt wrote an excellent, very short, very easy to grasp book called Economics in One Lesson. And this is actually the basis of a lot of homeschool teaching about economics. You can find it free on the FEE site. I think they have it probably on the Mises site as well. And it is a very, very good starter economics book. Okay? I put together a little curriculum for my own kids. I think it's only about a 20-week curriculum. I need to add to it. But that was one of the books. That was one of the books that we used. And so, Spacebind does all the teaching. The only thing I do with the kids is teach them how to read when they're young. So Henry Hazlitt has written this book. I wrote it in the 1950 or so. It's a good book. I recommend it to everyone. I think that it's a great place to start. It's easy to read, and if you read it, you will have a better grasp of economics than anybody in the media and 95% of the people that you'll meet. Okay, it's a good basis. That does not mean that it's flawless. That does not mean that it's perfect. That does not mean that it does not have major mistakes in it. Okay? Now, after I first started, I used to be a free trader. After I started having doubts about it, read Fletcher, realized he was right, and so forth. And you can read this stuff. If you go on my blog and look for the free trade tag and click on that, you can see the early posts. You can see my doubts starting. Don't get into side matters. We're talking about Henry Hazlitt and trade. We're not talking about fucking Ayn Rand and objectivism, okay? We're not talking about Karl Marx and communism. Stay the fuck on target. So, anyhow, when I first started developing my doubts about free trade and so forth, a lot of people started coming back pretty hard at me. A lot of my readers, a lot of my fans. And that was fine. That's good. We like that kind of thing. When it comes to the intellectual rough and tumble, I like it when my readers are intelligent, erudite, and are capable of presenting good arguments. So, one of the first things they did, unsurprisingly, was say, hey, what about Henry Hazlitt's case? Henry Hazlitt's case for free trade is different than David Ricardo's. All of your arguments about the comparative advantage and stuff and the flaws in that argument are not relevant. Have you considered this? And while I had read Henry Hazlitt long before, I had not considered his free trade arguments at that time. So I said, okay, fine. I'll go and read it. It's chapter 11. You can read it in 20 minutes. So I read it. And when I read things critically like this, I read them carefully. And so what I identified In this one chapter, Advocating Free Trade, I identified 23 specific errors in his argument. And so we're not going to have time to do them all tonight, so we're probably going to have to break this into 2 or 3 more sessions. But because I want to be able to take some questions and so forth. So I don't know, did any of you actually go, I posted this earlier on Gab and on Twitter. Did anyone actually go and read chapter 11? If you didn't, that's okay. I'm just pointing out that if you don't know what I'm talking about, if you can't follow what I'm talking about, go look it up. It's free. I think that, you can find a link to it. You don't have to read the whole book, just chapter 11. It's short. So anyhow, let me start. Error number 1. Hazlitt assumes that manufacturers are the primary beneficiaries from barriers to trade and therefore the leading advocates. Now, this may have been true when it was published, the book was published in 1946, because the U.S. balance of trade was running a 35% surplus and trade amounted to 6.8% of GDP. Now, at that time, free trade was operating to the benefit of American manufacturers and workers because the industrial infrastructures of Europe and Asia had been destroyed by World War II. So, the situation then was very, very different. Okay, the competition was different. The problem is now, if you look at the model that he used an example with a $5 tariff and sweater manufacturers. Okay, we're gonna go through here. The problem here is that when he was making comparisons, he was looking at a comparison, I think, with England. The problem is that now you have to compare it to places like Bangladesh, where they have a wage rate which is 1/30th of the USA. So the difference is that I went through all the math, and it says labor is 1/3 of the cost of production. International shipping is 10% of the manufacturing cost. The new production delivery cost is now $11.17. This reduces the costs to $3.83. So now the offshore manufacturer can afford to sell the imported sweater for $22.34 and still make the same 50% profit he did before. Without tariffs, he can compete on price with the $25 English sweater and actually increase his profit margin. At the old $30 price, his profit margin has risen to 63%. So the point is that either way, the consumers benefit, the manufacturers benefit, but all the workers lose. So what's happening here is that the tariff is protecting the manufacturer. Okay, I mean, in his scenario, he thinks that the $5 tariff is protecting the manufacturer from the English competitor and protecting the workers from the domestic manufacturer. Okay, so his main error here is that he fails to account for the international mobility of capital. So remember what I was saying is he thinks that the tariffs are there to protect the manufacturers, but they're not. In a situation with mobile capital, they are there to protect the domestic workers. That's error number 1. Error number 2. He assumes that the $5 left over from the reduced import price of the sweater will go to help employment in other industries in the United States. The problem is it might, or it might not. Hazlitt was writing when imports accounted for 2.9% of GDP. They now account for 15.8%. So that $5 that's left over is now 5 times more likely to go towards employment in industries outside the United States. Okay? So this is, because the situation has changed, his argument is no longer as effective. His argument is 1/5 as effective as it was back in 1946. Third, error 3. Hazlitt erroneously assumes that the British will buy more from the USA because they will be forced to buy more American goods due to their possession of dollars. Now we know that's not true because Apple has billions of dollars outside of the USA. A lot of the big successful corporations have billions and billions of dollars outside the USA. They do not need to go and purchase American goods. The foreign competitors, Hazlitt was writing before the phenomenon of the eurodollar. The eurodollar is dollar-denominated exchanges outside the United States. People always use, when Hazlitt was writing, they used to assume that they had to, if they sold something for dollars, they were going to have to buy American goods with it. Well, that's not true anymore because the U.S. is the global reserve currency. So they can, if they get dollars, they can spend them here in Italy, they can spend them in Qatar, they can spend them anywhere. So the point is, his assumption is false. Fourth error. Hazlitt assumes that foreign dollar balances cannot remain perpetually unused. This is actually pretty much the same. I mean, it's basically the same phenomenon, but it is a separate detail than the previous one, the previous assumption. So the $9 billion that went overseas back, in 1976 there was $9 billion that was overseas. That has now increased to $646 billion overseas. They don't have to return the favor and buy American goods, which means, of course, that the entire justification for free trade no longer applies in that regard. So I added a slightly sarcastic note here. 35 years and counting is a long time to wait for this inevitable return, and it is unlikely to do any good for the worker who lost his job 3 decades ago. Fifth, error 5. Hazlitt assumes that an American worker who loses his job in one sector will automatically find it in another sector. They won't. We know they won't. So, that money doesn't have to be, the money being held overseas is not due to tax policies. That's only if it's an American company. It doesn't apply in this particular situation that we're talking about. We're talking about a British company that sold a sweater to the United States for dollars. They're not keeping it in Europe because of tax purposes. They're keeping it in Europe because they can use it overseas. They don't need to use it in any way that's going to benefit American workers. So, error 6, Hazlitt assumes that American employment on net balance will not go down and that American and British production on net balance will go up. This is not necessarily true. The American worker may well remain unemployed on a permanent basis, as have 1/4 of the formerly employed male workers since 1948. So since the time he wrote this, justifying free trade on the basis of natural employment migrating from one sector to another in the domestic economy, 1/4 of those male jobs are gone. And then the 7th error, Hazlitt assumes that consumers in both countries are better off because they're able to buy what they want where they can get it cheapest. But this is a false assumption because most consumers are also workers or are dependent upon workers. The consumer who is employed can better afford the $30 sweater than the unemployed worker can afford the $25 sweater. So it is working to the minor advantage of some Americans, and it is working to the severe disadvantage of other Americans, and it's at a severe long-term cost to the American economy as a whole. Okay, it's great that your T-shirt might cost $15 instead of $20, but can you afford that $15 T-shirt better if you don't have a job? Of course not. So, anyhow, that's the first. That was what I considered the first section. Do you have any questions, or do you want me to continue to the next set of? I think it's 6. What do you think? Continue. Okay. Go ahead and ask a question then. Cornelius, you said you had a question. Go ahead and ask it. I'll deal with that, and then I'll go on to this. If you want to find where this stuff is all written down, you go to the blog. You'll find it. Just do a search for Hazlitt, and it'll show up. Okay. All right. Well, your question's going on too long, Cornelius. So save it. Shoot me an email or something. I'm going to continue here. So we had those are the first 7 errors that I identified. So let's go on to the second section. The error number 1. Hazlitt makes the mistake of assuming that only domestic goods are being consumed. As a result, he neglects to recognize the additional $5 that goes to the tariff isn't necessarily going to be spent on domestic products. Remember, we already noted that 15% of all spending is being spent on imports anyhow. So the maximum domestic benefit of that $5 tariff is really only $4.25. Okay? Okay, so he's partially right, but not entirely. So, 2. When he posits a 50,000 jobs lost in other industries due to the $5 tariff, he's assuming that labor productivity is the same in all domestic industries. This is not true. So, especially because he subscribes to Say's law, which says that supply creates its own demand, Hazlitt cannot possibly claim that existing production in other industries will disappear simply because people are spending 20% more money per sweater. Okay, and obviously there's the previous issue that I'd already mentioned. The third error here, it is incorrect to state that the new tariff on sweaters would not raise American wages. That's not true. First, no one's going to leave their job for a new job in the sweater industry unless they're getting paid more. Second, the new industry will require building a large amount of new infrastructure, so the additional demand for labor outside the industry will be created, thereby increasing wages. Is this not just overcomplicating? No, this is not just that. So, the fourth error in section 2, it is simply false to claim that tariffs reduce wages. We know that's not true. It's absolutely not true. All we have to do is look at the fact that we have far fewer wages than we did or far fewer tariffs than we did in 1973, and yet wages are lower in 2017 than they were in 1973. So, that's absolutely false. Error number 5. Hazlitt claims that American labor, capital, and land are deflected from what they can do more efficiently to what they do less efficiently. But this is a false assumption because it is a binary one, and it's not a binary situation. The fact that American sweater manufacturing is less efficient than English sweater manufacturing does not mean that it is less efficient than any other labor force, than any other American industry. So, especially in the case that we're discussing here with Hazlitt, we're dealing with a brand new industry with new capital investment, and therefore it will almost certainly be more efficient than existing domestic industries. That's another error. And then 6th, he talks about a paradox. There is no paradox. His assertion that a tariff must reduce real wages is simply incorrect, and then he repeats his error about assuming that production in the sweater industry will be less efficient than other domestic industries on the basis of its inefficiency in compared with English sweater industry. So, now that means so that was what, 6 plus 7, so that was 13 specific errors in his defense of free trade. So, I think we can continue now. Actually, no, I think that's enough for tonight. We'll do a part 3 to cover the other ones. But my point is that if the great defender of free trade Henry Hazlitt, has 13 errors in his not terribly long defense of free trade, what does that tell you? What is the rational conclusion? That's not the rational conclusion. Okay, if the best that you can do, is to come up with a case that has 13 errors in it, your case is not correct. Your case does not work. If that is your defense of free trade, then free trade is obviously not beneficial the way you believe it to be. Now, we don't know the full extent that it might be harmful. Sometimes it might be better, sometimes it might be worse. But the point is, this is what people are claiming justifies our current free trade policies. And so it's not sound, it doesn't work, it is incorrect. Okay? And anytime you hear somebody talking about free trade, bring up, Hazlitt didn't work for anyone in particular. He was an honest guy. He actually, his attack on Keynes and the New Economists was actually pretty good. So anyhow, so the thing is that whenever you see the Wall Street Journal or the Economist talking about how free trade is the answer, it's not true. And what you should do is you should simply ask questions. And what you will find every single time is that the basis for their defense of free trade is going to either be Ricardo or it's going to be Hazlitt. They might mention Mises or Rothbard or someone else, but those guys have never really done significant work on free trade. No, I don't call myself a nationalist libertarian anymore, and I'm not certain about the benefits of free trade within the country, because I think that part of our problems in the USA are actually are partly based on labor mobility within the USA. So, here's what you need to understand, and this is what I find somewhat frustrating sometimes talking with folks here, is that I don't have a settled opinion on things. And I don't pretend to have an answer for everything. So it's important to not say, if I'm talking about a problem, it is absolutely incorrect and inappropriate to say, well, what should we do? I don't know. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about the problem. If a doctor if a surgeon is cutting on somebody, that's not the time to ask about, how many miles should he jog a week? We're focused on something narrowly, and leaping back and trying to go to these. So what do we know? We know communism doesn't work. We know free trade doesn't work. Now, I think what we probably have to look to is what has worked and is working, has worked in the past and is working currently. What works? Well, obviously protectionism works. The United States had no National Socialism doesn't work. All you Nazi LARPers are retards. Okay, I'll just tell you that flat out. I've reached an accommodation with a lot of them. Some of their goals are goals that I respect, but and I've agreed not to refer to them as the alt retard much, as long as they leave me alone. But if you think, I mean, there is a reason why National Socialism is a dead ideology. Okay? Teutonic imperialism is not only not the answer to anything, but it is anti-white. If you are a Nazi, you are anti-white. It's that simple. And so, you guys can dance around it all you want and do the Hitler did nothing wrong thing all you want and that sort of thing, but you're fucking retards. And I will happily debate any of you in any medium and humiliate you easily. Okay? So it's good to oppose communism, but what you need to do is not be a binary thinker. Okay? The fact that communism is bad does not make National Socialism good. I mean, Japan, it's a little bit difficult to say because, Japan is so unique. I lived in Japan for 6 months. I studied there. I speak a bit of the language still. And so how do you translate the Japanese mindset into a Western country or an African country? I don't even see how that's realistically possible. And what I think that we need to deal with and accept is the idea that what works for one nation is not necessarily going to work for another nation. It's simplistic to assume. One of the problems with the American mindset is the notion that people are all the same, that people are fungible, that everything, what will work for one group of people must necessarily work for every other group of people. I don't see any indication in history that that's true. So, anyhow, I hope you found this useful and informative. Again, whenever you're dealing with somebody who is talking up free trade, I encourage you to ask them why. And if they respond with Ricardo, if they respond with comparative advantage, if they respond with something more sophisticated like Henry Hazlitt, then you have them. Because all those cases are intrinsically and fundamentally flawed. Have a good evening.